Hi, Ross. Pleasure to meet again following from our last session. I'm extremely excited to hear about what's taking place in the market right now. And I'm excited, like everyone else listening to this, to hear significant changes and what should the market be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that I can update you on that we've been working on. First of all, on our investor self-declaration system, we've implemented APIs. And if you recall, most financial institutions collect these American W-8 forms on paper. And we still think there are about 850 million pieces of paper floating around the world. And what most financial institutions get wrong is when they collect these forms, they just say, yeah, I've got the form, and they put it in a filing cabinet, and it's fire and forget. And in actual fact, they've got to do three things with that piece of paper when they receive it. They've got to check the data's correct on the form. They've got to check the data matches the KYC data. And then they've got to check to make sure there's no other reason that the form might be unreliable. And so what we did with the investor self-declaration, which is the digital version of the W8 series and the W9, is we created these APIs because the IRS allows financial institutions to pre-populate parts of the W8 forms. So with an API, we can take KYC data from the onboarding platform, pre-populate it onto the ISD, which makes for a smoother client experience. They don't have to think quite as much. It's more confirming information they've already given. So that's the first part of the API library that we have, is the pre-population. The second component is, while we're taking the clients through this questionnaire in order to fill in the W8 substitute, we're asking all sorts of other questions which are useful. For example, we're asking kinds of questions that identify whether there are any US indicia on the form. Whether the client has been in the United States for more than 183 days in the previous 3 years. All of that information is useful information. So once we've gathered it, the second API can then export all of the answers in data form to the platform. And that means the financial institution has got a much richer data set than just the information that's on the form itself.
Can you, Ross, elaborate a little bit on why? I know you referred to the data being useful. Maybe you could elaborate on why it is useful.
Well, I think under the US regulations, there is this concept of reason to know and actual knowledge. And it's like the catch-all that the Americans use. They said, we can give you some specific things that you must do, but then at the end of it, the catch-all is, and if there's anything else that you know, you have to take a certain course of action. And so it's actually very difficult for a financial institution to start asking its client, okay, were you in the United States 3 years ago? If so, how many days? 2 years ago, how many days? That to a financial institution is a real pain to do. And so when you're gathering that kind of information in a questionnaire, it's much easier to get. And for entities, the same issue. If you're trying to use an entity form and you want to claim the tax treaty benefits with the US's tax treaties all have a special clause called the limitation on benefits, which means that even though you're in a country that has a double tax treaty with the US, you can't have treaty benefits unless you meet an additional set of criteria called the limitation of benefits. And there are, I think, 5 different types of limitation of benefits. And you have to be able to select one of them and say, my firm meets this test. And the financial institution has to make a judgment. If I say I meet the base erosion and profit shifting test, in other words, I haven't moved my profits anywhere to a lower tax jurisdiction, I'm making a statement that the financial institution would have real difficulty trying to figure out whether that was correct or not. But when I make the certification on an ISD, I'm making it under penalty of perjury. So all of that additional data isn't necessarily on the form itself always. Yes, so the form doesn't have years in the United States for an individual, for example. So that information is useful because it means that the financial institution's got richer data about its customers.
And avoid potential liability possibly as well.
And penalties, yeah. And that's also the second topic I wanted to cover, because we're sort of almost at the beginning of March now, and we're getting towards the US tax reporting season, the CRS reporting season, and the FATCA reporting season. All of this is coming in the next few months. But the first one is the 1042S information returns. And we are seeing a significant increase in the number of financial institutions that are subject to penalties. And the penalties are because they reported incorrectly. And they reported incorrectly because they withheld incorrectly. They withheld incorrectly because the documentation wasn't right. And you and I are on the same page on this. We say it every time, which is you have to get the start point right. You have to get the documentation right. If you get that right, everything else follows naturally. If you get it wrong, it will go wrong all the way through.
And I think mediation is one area that many financial investment firms, we hear about it all the time, Ross. But of course, if they get this right in the first place, it's just going to save them enormous amounts of time and of course also, as you mentioned, penalties.
Yeah, I mean, there's a financial firm, I won't mention names, in Asia at the moment that's sitting in front of a $1 million penalty, and it's a $1 million penalty on reporting. But when you look back at it, it's because the financial institution made a mistake in, I think it was 2014. They failed to report correctly. The IRS picked that up, and the IRS just kept adding interest, because the financial institution in Asia, different culture, different language, didn't understand what was being said to them, and the penalty just kept increasing and compounding up. So what started as a $6,000 penalty ends up as a $1 million liability and legal claim. And this is happening more and more often.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Ross, I just want to touch upon, because, of course, as you know, we're incredibly driven by data. We, like you, believe strongly in collecting the correct data and actually ensuring that the user experience is also pleasant. It's also about that as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm also very excited about the APIs that you have in place now, which for many, in particular, if they want to connect some data sets into their infrastructure, their CRM, and so forth, this is going to make it so much easier for them. Can you just give a little bit of not necessarily advice, but we do see a lot of financial institutions that are still not quite there yet. How would you try to encourage them to look more towards digitization and the value of making sure that not only the data collection is taking place in a, you could say, in a logical, rational manner for the end user, therefore the experience is good, but also how it's going to really benefit them long term as well, and how the whole process will just become very much streamlined without them having to worry about it.
Yeah, I can talk to that for hours. I mean, a lot of our clients are tier 2 financial institutions generally. So typically the largest bank or the largest broker in any given country will be one of our clients. And their approach to technology is, as you say, they're very resistant to change. And when we talk to them, we're not talking to the front office. We're usually talking to the back office, and that's where the people are collecting all of these forms. And there are a number of occasions where I've walked into one of these financial institutions and said, okay, you've got this wonderful, bright, shiny front end, so the client thinks you're wonderful and perfect, and you talk to the back office and it's Dickensian in some respects. And two things happen. Either they have more resource than they need pointed at collecting these bits of paper and then looking at these bits of paper and figuring out what are we supposed to do with these bits of paper. And particularly on the tax front, of course, it's important because this affects the net value of a client's assets in their accounts. So either they over-resource when they don't need to, or they don't have enough resource and they're not doing things that they should be doing. The example I gave before, which is how you validate the W-8 forms. And most institutions, when we first speak to them, have no clue about the process they're supposed to have. And as soon as it's explained to them, they're tearing their hair out and basically saying, well, we haven't done this before. Why should we do it? And you know, for qualified intermediaries, I make a very simple response. I said, you just signed a 205-page legal contract with the US government. Do you think it's 205 pages because they just wanted to pad it out a bit? No, they didn't. They made it that long because that's how long it needs to be to tell the withholding agent what they need to do. And most of it, again, comes back to onboarding.
Yes, exactly. That's perfect, actually, Ross, because we experience the same, and we're beginning to see more movement in the back office where they feel that they definitely need more assistance in terms of digitization and automation, and of course, at the end of the day, to really protect the financial investment firm and as well as the investors. And there is definitely a progression. We wish it was a little bit faster, but we do feel that more and more tax in-house and legal also counsels in-house and compliance are definitely looking for tools. And of course, our advice is always don't invest resources building this internally. It's a mammoth amount of work that goes into this. And the updates and the connectivities, and as you mentioned, the API integrations and keeping up to date with technology is a mammoth task. And it's not really a task for investment firms to do when there are providers like yourselves and ours that are doing that. So that's exciting. I'm actually excited to see what's going to happen in the next phase. So how do you feel is there anything exciting coming up in the coming period?
Yes. Yeah, there's a couple of things. If I might speak just 1 second longer on the ISD front. The other important thing about the ISD is it's not just collecting US-centric information. It's collecting CRS information and FATCA information at the same time. And we're also, you know, tasked by clients quite often. So, are we doing our FATCA reporting correctly? How do we get CRS reporting done correctly? And again, it comes back to identifying at onboarding whether your client is reportable to another jurisdiction or more than one jurisdiction. And so the ISD collects that information as part of the questionnaire. It's almost like the client doesn't realize what they're doing by answering the questions, although the ISD explains it to them. But the net result is that if you have an ISD, there are 3 or 4 forms that one ISD is replacing. Plus you're making it standardized and you're digitizing it. So it's a win-win.
Where do you see here the errors happening, actually, Ross, when you go in and get exposure to maybe a remediation project and you step in to assist? Where do you often see the gaps?
Well, yes. I mean, it comes down to looking at, you know, what did you do and when did you do it? You know, did you report late? That's a financial institution issue. Did you report correctly? Okay, tell me, how did you come to decide that any given set of accounts was reportable or not? And, you know, that comes to, you know, if you're in one jurisdiction, how are you tracking whether your jurisdiction is partnering on a CRS front with more jurisdictions? You know, are you only collecting the CRS information for the reportable jurisdictions, or are you using what the OECD calls the wider approach, which is collect the CRS status of all clients, because you don't know when your jurisdictional authority is going to expand the number of reportable partners it has. And so that, you know, the ISD typically, again, solves that problem, which is why we built it. But generally speaking, people don't find out they've done something wrong until a competent authority comes along and says, we're not sure you understand what you're supposed to be doing, or they get slapped with a penalty.
Yeah. Do you often find that some of those large financial institutions and brokers, do they normally have external audit taking place over these type of documentations, or do they typically just do what they're doing and hope at one point that what they are doing is accurate and correct?
I think my observation, and this may not be a popular observation, I'd have to say, which is the audit departments are really great as long as they understand what it is they're supposed to be auditing. Now, auditing the financial records of a financial institution is clear and obvious, but most audit departments that we come across don't know that they're able to audit, let's say, QI compliance. And when we look at qualified intermediaries, and I think there are, 3,900 firms around the world that are QIs, the IRS allows a financial institution to do its periodic review, an audit once every 3 years, either using an external party like us, a traditional auditor, or internal audit. Now, we're out in the marketplace, we see the auditing companies, the big ones, charging anything from 60 to 80,000 pounds upwards for a review. But the internal audit is equally able to do that. The problem is nobody tells the internal audit department, hey, we've got the requirement to do a periodic review. Can you do it? You're independent, but generally speaking, they're not necessarily competent. So the QI agreement says you can use an internal auditor to do your periodic review, but they must be independent, okay, and they must be competent. Well, competency equals experience. We have the experience and we're competent and we're independent. So if nobody tells the internal audit team, you need to go figure out how this happens in the bank, then they can't create a framework to do that periodic review. So they may be independent, but they're not competent enough to do it. Yeah. So yes, you asked me whether anything was coming up, and I think the big thing on everybody's mind is the European Union directive called FASTER. And I have the privilege of sitting on the Commission's large working group, which is formed recently after the directive got approved by Commission, the Parliament, etc. So the text of the directive is now settled. The political discussion is over, and we're into the, okay, now we know what we have to do. The question is, how do we do it? And for viewers, you know, the real simple, straightforward view here is there are three components to FASTER.
And just before we do that, Ross, am I correct to say that that's being transposed into national law end of next year? Or
probably 2029 is the last date where it has to be transposed.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so the directive doesn't come into force until January the 1st, 2030. And I am out on social media and basically saying to people, do not make the mistake of saying, oh, that's a long way away, we don't need to do anything today. That is absolutely the wrong approach. You have to be starting to plan for it. So the three components of the FASTER Directive, one is this idea of a certified financial intermediary, very similar to the idea of a QI. Essentially what the European Union is doing is it's saying, we want any financial institution, including those outside of an EU jurisdiction, as well as other member states. Financial institutions can become withholding agents for that member state. So a French bank could apply to be a CFI in Germany, okay? And so they would be a withholding agent in Germany. The principle is that all of the European member states should adopt relief at source, quick refund, as well as the current standard refund model. The European Union is building a central portal through which financial institutions can apply to be CFIs. Now, there are some types of financial institutions that don't have any choice. They're called large financial institutions, and that's defined by another European directive. And essentially, it's if your assets on your balance sheet are greater than 70 billion euros, you must be a certified financial intermediary, essentially because they're saying they're systemically important institutions. So financial institutions get to decide, do you want to be? So are you mandated to be a CFI, or do you voluntarily want to become a CFI? That's the other option.
Yeah. And what's the benefit of them becoming one?
Well, it then makes them eligible to provide tax relief at source. Now, the European Union at the moment is, and has been for about 35 years, a complete and utter mess when it comes to withholding tax. Everybody's doing different things. Some are doing relief at source, some are doing quick refund, most are doing standard refunds, which can take as little as 11 weeks to get your money back from a tax authority, up to 20 years. So the variation is amazing. So what the directive is trying to do is trying to bring that all together and simplify it, standardize it, and provide the opportunity for automation.
And do you think it'll be harmonized, actually, Ross? And we know it's a directive. Can you see issues coming about from that?
Lots. I think that's one of the things that the large working group is addressing. And there are large numbers of people who are making commentary and say, I mean, my beef, if you will, for example, is if you read the directive, it's not clear whether a financial institution can apply for a tax residency certificate on behalf of its clients. Now, the second component, so if I mention CFIs, the second component is the requirement for all member states to produce an electronic tax residency certificate and to produce it on request within 15 days. Now, when the first directive came out, the text said within 1 day. And then the next directive text came out and it was 5 days. So by the time it went into the actual directive, it's 15 days. So there's a number of different issues that come with that, which is if you're a financial institution and you've got, I don't know, 200,000 clients, and I know several that have that kind of client base, if the directive says, in order for every one of those clients to be able to ask you as a financial institution to provide them with relief at source in, let's say, 9 different jurisdictions, it doesn't say whether I'm supposed to get 9 electronic tax residency certificates, one claiming for France, one claiming for Germany, or whether I'm getting 1 electronic tax residency certificate claiming in all of them.
But do you see that creating potentially a competitive advantage for some?
Yes.
Depending on, of course, the speed and technological advancement and so forth?
Yes. Yes, I think the opportunity for new products and new services is enormous, but it depends on how the directive transposes not into legislation, but into settled guidance. And that was one of the problems. I was on the European Commission Tax Barriers Business Advisory Group in 2013. One of the, I think it was the third comment that we made was there is no clear guidance from member states as to who is entitled and how they get that entitlement. So the electronic tax residency certificate is an issue. If you're a large financial institution with many thousands of clients, in order to provide tax relief, you're going to have to get them to get a tax residency certificate, and that may take 15 days. So there is a possibility in 2029, leading into 2030, that there will be a massive spike in people applying for these electronic tax residency certificates because they don't exist today, and whether the tax administrations can keep up with that kind of demand, because these residency certificates only last for a year. So the difference here is with the US W8 form, that's valid for 3 years. The electronic tax residency certificate has to be renewed every year. So that's also an enormous workload on the financial institution to remind its clients, because clients have terrible memories, and for the clients themselves to go through the work effort of applying for a new tax residency certificate.
Making sure they have it also updated on the record at all times as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to assume on that, Ross, there'll be a cost associated with that as well.
I'm sure there will be, yes.
Yeah.
But the other thing about the directive is it provides I don't think I can cite the article number, but what it says is, in order to provide tax relief at source for a client, first off, you have to have an electronic tax residency certificate. That's merely providing evidence of their place of residence for tax purposes. The second thing that the financial institution has to do is get a declaration from their client that they meet certain criteria, which is very similar, if you look at it, to the certification statements on a W-8 form. Now, the W-8 is a self-certification of residency, whereas in the European Union, they're using a certificate of residence issued by a competent authority. But the opportunity there is this declaration currently doesn't have any format. It's just, this is what the client has to declare, as well as having the electronic tax residency certificate, in order that the financial institution can proceed. So just looking at those two components, the financial world is going to have a lot of work to do and a lot of money to spend between now and 2030. The
and
third
a
component
authority, in your opinion, Ross, you're in the UK. Who would that be?
In the UK, it would be HMRC.
Exactly.
The one country that is, I guess, challenged more than anything else is Finland. And that's because Finland adopted the OECD Tax Relief and Compliance Enhancement Program, TRACE.
Yeah.
And so there's discourse going on at the moment as to whether TRACE meets the definition in the directive for, I quote, a comprehensive relief at source system.
Okay.
Now, there are people out there who will say, yes, it does, no problem. So TRACE equals, meets the definition, so it can be considered okay for the FASTER Directive. And there are others that say, well, hang on a second, the issue is exclusions.
Mm-hmm.
So in the directive, there are clauses which allow a financial institution to deny tax relief at source.
Okay.
And I think there are there are 5 scenarios where they are allowed to deny relief at source. I misspeak. It's not the financial institution that gets to decide that. It's the member state that decides whether you deny relief at source. And the question is, and the question is whether the TRACE model in those particular scenarios works for the FASTER Directive.
Okay.
Either way, it's to my mind, we're replacing one form of complexity with another. The benefit, I guess, is that the replaced the kind of complexity we're replacing it with at least gives the opportunity for that standardization and automation, which the previous paper-based systems just didn't do.
Exactly.
The last component of the FASTER Directive, of course, is reporting. And again, even with the US system, the reporting is annual. Mm-hmm. The reporting in the FASTER Directive is every 20 days.
Okay.
So, there's the reporting scenario, which will be XML based, and the large working group is looking at that and providing the guidance, if you will, to figure out what the technical aspects of it are, which can then get released into the market, and people can start looking at it and saying, right, here is a product opportunity, or here is how we as a financial institution are going to respond to that.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, if someone gets relief at source on a dividend, that relief at source and the dividend has to be reported within 20 days of, I think it's the payment date, or it might be the X date. But from financial institutions in and between European member states, you could end up with them almost doing continuous reporting, because dividend on day 1 is report by day 20, dividend day 2 is report by day 20, which is 1 day later, and it starts to get really messy.
Yeah. So there might be changes on that front potentially.
But again, I keep coming back to it, which is, although the electronic tax residency certificate is likely to become a fundamental part of onboarding.
Yes.
Again, it's still not technically KYC. It doesn't come under KYC regulation. And in the same way that your firm and I firm collaborate, because the best time to get this documentation in valid form is at onboarding. And these financial
And it might-
institutions have to
and it might
focus on that.
Yeah, and it might potentially cover other aspects of the KYC and eliminate the need for other things as well. So it could be quite exciting. How do you, in terms, you've been in this space for many years, Ross. I don't think anyone can doubt your expertise and passion also for the space. What would you predict might be coming next? I mean, we get excited over obviously new directives that are really changing the behavior, removing paper trails, putting a little bit more order, creating more transparency and order in the market. But of course, like at the beginning of our session, we spoke about, is the market really ready? Even some financial institutions that have a phenomenal front end and the back end is still trying to figure out what to do, and sometimes it's solved by human resources, which we both know is not necessarily the way to solve major complex issues. How do you, with the FASTER Directive now coming up, how do you feel is really, I'm not even going to speak about the world, but is Europe ready? and where do you see this moving next?
I think the direction of travel is good. So I'd mentioned before, if you looked at it pessimistically, they're replacing one form of complexity with another. I think if you add the additional layer of the fact that the thing that they're being replaced with is digital and standardized information, it becomes theoretically much easier for financial institutions to deal with. It's the reason that we did the ISDs, because we sort of talk to financial institutions and say to them, how do you collect the documents for tax purposes? And they say, oh yeah, we use the paper form W8. And my jaw just drops. And I'm going, you use paper? Seriously? How can you operate a bank based on paper forms flying all over the place? So I think the trend is moving forward to automation. As you know, I also sit on 3 of the subcommittees of the International Standards Organization, ISO, who are implementing ISO 20022 at the moment. And I know that ISO has been approached because the European Union wants all of this digitization to have a standard, if you will. And so ISO will be involved in the European FASTER Directive in terms of, once you get to the technical, here are the data components we need, now we have to have a message to go between 2 financial institutions. What does that message look like and how is it standardized? You mentioned the world, and I think, I tend not to speak politically when I can avoid it, but I think I have to reference the fact that we live in much more uncertain times at the moment. The level of cross-border investment might change its form, if you will. At the moment, the US represents, I think it's 54% of world investment. So that's been a direction ever since 1945. And in the post-war era, America has become more and more powerful in that respect, to the point where, the reason that we focus on the QI stuff is simply because when we talk to a financial institution and their clients, most clients want to buy US stocks, whether that's Apple or Microsoft on the tech side, or other stocks. So it's an easy sell in that respect, because our argument is your clients want access to US securities. In order to get access to US securities, your financial institution must be compliant with US tax law. That's where we come in. The other direction I think I would mention here is the fact that we deal with tier 2, not tier 1 banks. It's not that we don't try and sell to tier 1 banks, it's just that we wait for them to call us. And the tier 1 financial institutions have huge resources, and they spend large amounts of money on tech projects. So, for us as a relatively small company, it's our expertise that's valuable more than anything else. And the second tier banks, I think, are the ones that, even with FASTER, are still going to be challenged, because they're not at the top of the payment chain. the directive again sort of says there are occasions where relief at source can be denied if any financial institution in the payment chain is not a CFI. Now, that's an important line to pick up on, because it in principle will push more and more smaller financial institutions to adopt CFI status at the European portal. The question is, what happens then? What are they obligated to do? It's the parallel to, you've just signed a 205-page QI agreement with the US government. What happens next? And we have clients where, we took the client on and we asked them that question and said, what were you thinking when you basically got this QI agreement in place? And it's typically, we sort of applied because somebody told us we should. And now that we've got QI status, we don't really know what that means. And I don't originally come from financial services. I come from an engineering background. So, as I've said many times before, I spend 30% of my time helping people to plan properly. And I spend 70% of my time digging people out of holes they got into because they didn't plan properly. So that's my passion. Unfortunately, it's a 70-30 split at the moment, and I'm digging more people out of holes than I am helping people to plan.
And I know, at least, Ross, you would love to avoid that where possible. And that's, of course, the purpose of some of these sessions between us, is to help the market understand that there are definitely solutions out there. And by correctly planning and knowing exactly what you're getting yourself into, at least before you do it, is a good idea to try to see what's happening and what's out there. And ultimately not only lean on humans, but also we'll start leaning more towards technology. And I think it's a no-brainer. A lot of what's happening in the European Union is definitely moving towards automation, digitization. Hopefully with that, we see more and more harmonization as well, between, at least on a cross-border basis. But I think there's still a little bit longer to go.
Well, there's also a degree to which financial institutions are tripping over themselves. I mean, you and I can talk about whether it's QI or the FASTER Directive, but actually in Europe, they may be subject to the QI, FATCA, CRS, BEPS, DAX 6, in fact, DAX 1 to 8, as soon as you start adding digital assets. And so the number of regulations covering what a financial institutions do is enormous. And getting one right is okay, and that takes effort and attention. But you've got to make sure that if there are benefits to be gained by doing one thing over here, that it also helps you with something else. And again, that gets back to the ISD.
Exactly. We're beginning to see, I've been in this space for over 21 years now. And I must admit, we're beginning to see more and more now experts going in-house, which is a good sign. We're beginning to see transformation divisions also internally, and really where they're leading between the experts and also the digital and automation front, and also looking for external solutions. But that's not common across the market, and for sure it's not common across the globe. There are definitely different competences across when at least we meet, and seeing how far is our world in the European Union progressing compared to the rest of the world. But it's interesting. And as I said, we get excited over these directives because it's making the authorities think differently. And that's definitely a step forward. Whether the implementation goes exactly to plan, we both know, Ross, it's not. There'll be learnings and there'll be improvements and then further committee discussions, but it's positive.
Just on a final word on the FASTER front, there is a withholding tax summit being planned for June this year. It's going to be held in London. So if anybody watching wants more details, then just reach out.
Perfect. Good.
Cool. Well, thanks for your time, Remonda. It's been a pleasure as always.
You too, Ross. Absolutely.
Hopefully we'll do this again soon.
I look forward to it.
Thank you.